Today we will be discussing A Beautiful Mind, directed by Ron Howard, based on the life and work of John Nash, played by Russell Crowe. He was a genius mathematician who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The production design, as well as the cinematography and mise-en-scène, convey subjectivity through the perspective of our schizophrenic protagonist. This movie is one of the very few movies ever made that was shot in story order to help Russell Crowe enhance the development of the main character. Russell Crowe's acting captures perfectly how John Nash's illness developed in real life. The first hallucination we see is just a couple minutes into the movie, where we see John in his first few days of grad school at Princeton. The refracted light from the crystal tumbler bounces off and travels across the table to another student's tie. This hints how his mind works differently and he perceives things that others cannot. His first hallucination of another person is his roommate Charles. In real life, John Nash only had auditory hallucinations. Ron Howard included this detail and hints at John's hallucinations by introducing them audibly and then visually.
Oh, Christ. The prodigal roommate arrives. Oh, God, no. Huh? Did you know that?
We hear and see all of John's hallucinations from his point of view the first time we meet them, and generally every time they are in the narrative. Another example of this is when John meets Marcy, Charles's niece. She is introduced by her voice rather than her face.
What are you doing?
As well as Parcher, the government official John believes he is working for.
Professor Nash.
Going back to John's time at Princeton, there are many shots showing how John uses windows to write down his work. The set design captures what is in John's beautiful mind by displaying it on the delicate glass and framing John amongst the numbers. During his time at school, we can see how his illness develops. In this scene, the camera movement purposely makes it appear as though John is not talking to anyone until we see Charles behind the bookshelf.
I can't even find a copy for my doctor. Well, on the bright side, you've invented window art.
We only seem to see Charles when John is alone. He is never in scenes where John spends time with the other mathematicians at Princeton. The first time we meet Parcher is when John goes to the Pentagon. John asks another character who the man is that's watching them, but the other character simply ignores his question, hinting to the audience that Parcher is not really there.
Who's Big Brother? Done your country a great service, son. Captain.
It is unclear in the film whether John Nash actually ever went to the Pentagon at all. Nash confuses reality with his delusions so seamlessly, and this confusion leaves the answer ambiguous. Once John starts to get involved with his alleged secret government job, the conflict of the story begins to increase in tension. John enters a world where he looks out of place, and the aesthetic of the set changes completely in these government facilities. The technology in these scenes is completely unrealistic of that time period, further hinting that what we are watching is not reality. The car chase is very unusual compared to car chases in other films. The music sets a completely different tone than what the audience would expect from a car chase, and ends extremely abruptly, leaving the viewers as confused as ever right before the midpoint of the film. After being forcefully escorted from an assembly at MIT, we see John waking up in a psychiatric hospital in Dr. Rosen's office. Dr. Rosen tries to explain to John that he is sick, but John feels betrayed by Charles, who he believes put him in the hospital. From John's point of view, we see Dr. Rosen and Charles. The lighting of the shots are very different and cut back and forth quickly to signal John's confusion. Dr. Rosen is shot from a low angle and looks powerful, foreboding, and dark. Charles only takes up half the frame and is blocked by furniture on either side. Charles is extremely out of place in this space, which makes the viewer question why he would be there at all. Akiva Goldsman made it his goal as the screenwriter to not allow the viewers to understand they are viewing an alternate reality until a specific point in the film. This was done to rob viewers of their feelings in the same way Nash was. Up until the midpoint, the viewers do not know that everything they'd seen had been subjective and from John's point of view. until the doctor diagnoses him with schizophrenia and announces it to John's wife and more so the audience, we are given no reason not to trust our protagonist. At this point, the movie shifts completely and breaks down all the subjectivity in the first half of the movie that the audience believed to be true. John's wife, Alicia, played by Jennifer Connelly, starts to understand his reality by visiting his office, the abandoned mansion, and retrieving his letters supposedly sent to the government. The world of the movie shifts from John's subjectivity, and the audience understands how his schizophrenia has affected his reality. Now the audience can trust the camera as an objective storyteller. But John still has a long way to go to overcome his illness. He stops taking his medication because it's affecting his work and his marriage, and he starts to have hallucinations again. In the shed of his backyard, he sees military personnel in a makeshift government facility. This is shown from John's point of view. This time, the audience knows that we cannot trust what we see, and John tries to convince himself as well. This comes to a climax when John almost hurts his family because of his hallucinations. We see the horrifying cross-cutting between Alicia discovering his work in the shed and the bath flooding with water as their baby cries in the tub. Alicia runs into the house, saves the baby, and tries to call the doctor. In this scene, the camera cuts back and forth between reality and John's hallucinations, which are again shot from his point of view. This quick comparison editing helps the viewers to understand how John's delusions affect his reality. The turning point in the road of recovery is depicted through quick and frantic edits. The music builds as we cut from John's face, his delusions in the present, his delusions in the past, and flashbacks. The camera movement also breaks the 180 rule, disorienting the viewer even further. It is at this point that he can convince himself they are not real, because after all these years, Marcy never gets older.
John! Oh, Christ, John, please, do what he says. Move, soldier. Now.
Uncle John.
John, please! Now! Alicia and Charles don't coexist at the same time. Cannot coexist with Alicia. Why? Charles is watching with Alicia. I understand.
John has to say goodbye to his hallucinations in a beautiful scene in the halls of Princeton. From his point of view, we can see him kissing Marcy goodbye, but the camera reveals that he is in fact interacting with air. This point of view shot helps the audience understand John's mind and what he experiences, yet the wide shot reminds us that it is just strictly in his mind. At the end of the movie, John Nash still sees his hallucinations, but they no longer affect his reality. He says, "I see things, I choose not to acknowledge them." This line and final scene where John turns his back on his hallucinations and walks out with his wife leaves the viewer with a satisfied ending to a story where our protagonist has overcome his struggle against all odds.